Hi, so here we
Hello.
are. Perfect. So welcome back from the coffee break. So now it's the turn of our last speaker, Dr. Dorothy Cowie. Actually, Maria Laura has give you a lot of duties, so we can we look forward to listen to your talk. Allow me to introduce you properly. So Dr. Dorothy Cowie is an associate professor in psychology at Durham University. She was trained at Oxford and UCL before moving to Durham as a lecturer. She works on children's motor control and body representation using motor capture and virtual reality to measure children's movement and to present them with moving virtual bodies. Much of her work has used touch to ground the sense of bodily self, and this talk titled Touch as an Anchor for Bodily Awareness in Childhood, she will synthesize her findings on the role of touch in children's bodily awareness. So thank you again, Dorothy.
Thank you for having me. So I'll just check that you can see my slides.
Yeah.
Can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. So I feel like I've had to do for this talk what I tell my students to do, which is like just answer the question, don't. So during this talk, I'm going to try and answer the question about what I have found out about the role of touch in bodily awareness. And I'm not going to tell you everything that I've done. I'm just going to really focus on touch. And actually, this was a really, really interesting exercise for me. So thank you so much for making me do it. I started off actually working in vision and quite low-level vision as an undergraduate. I've always been quite focused on vision, and I feel like in writing this talk, I've discovered that touch has been there all along, a bit like the neglected younger child, and maybe I'll start to pay it some more attention now. so, so yeah, I'll just take you through what I've learned about the role of touch in how children understand their own bodies. So we know, as I'll refer back to Maria Laura now, but while body awareness is obviously difficult to measure in young childhood and infancy, we do know that there are very strong sensory foundations that are present very early on, so multisensory foundations. And we've seen this with paradigms that have been used by Maria Laura has shown us already today with the in-facelet illusion, where you can stroke on an infant's face and see the stroking and feel the stroking at the same time, and also visual motor studies, which were done a while ago using leg kicking. So here is an example kind of study by Rocha, where the infant is kicking their own legs and they can see legs contingently kicking on a screen. And you can vary those multisensory contingencies so that the viewed and felt movements are correlated or not, and an infant is sensitive in terms of their looking behaviour to whether the viewed and felt movements are synchronous. So that these multisensory synchronies, the infant can detect them and is sensitive to them quite early in life. Actually, someone else mentioned this morning as well this nice work about self-touch that's coming out of the Jeff Lockman lab. So this is a paper by Lisa Chin, where she measures infants' ability to touch buzzers which go off on different parts of their body, and indeed targets on the face. So here I've shown the ears, for example, targets on the face over, you can see that over the first, second years of life, children are increasingly able to localize touches to their own body. And they propose that this self-touch is actually used to build maps of the infant's own body. So again, we know that there are abilities like this that are present quite early on in infancy. Additionally, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but there is some studies that suggest that by 1 year old, the infant can localize touch in external coordinates. So if the infant receives a touch on their hand while the hands are in an uncrossed posture, of course, the visual and tactile maps of the body in that case are naturally lined up. But if the hands are put into a crossed posture, we're not used to feeling a touch and seeing it over at this, to feeling a touch on the right hand, but seeing it over in the left side of space. And so the visual and tactile maps are not aligned. And in that case, an adult, or indeed an older infant, has trouble locating that touch. And what it shows is that normally the visual and tactile worlds are synchronized and have a mapping between them that the infant is automatically using. And we can see evidence that that kind of visual tactile mapping is also present in the first year of life. So again, there's sort of evidence for quite early abilities to use touch to understand the body and to localize external touches within external space. And so actually most of my work has not focused on infancy, it's focused on mid-childhood. And given that we do have these early abilities, one might wonder, why do I bother looking at mid-childhood? But actually the reason is that we know that during mid-childhood there's a lot of change, and the representation of the body has got a lot to deal with, because there are a lot of profound changes to visual and proprioceptive inputs during that period. So the other sensory weightings surrounding vision and proprioception, we know they change really profoundly during childhood. Not only do these sensory inputs change, but there are, of course, huge changes to body size and shape, which feed into proprioception. Lucilla Cardinali has some nice work recently showing that there is significant misperception of bodily size during childhood. And basically, all these visual and proprioceptive inputs and their weightings are really in flux through the whole childhood period. So there's some nice work actually from the motor control arena from Hay, done many years ago now, but that shows that there are significant changes to how we weight vision and proprioception for our reaching and pointing movements, and those are going on right the way up to 8-10 years of age. So there's a lot of argument for trying to understand how body representations maintain any kind of consistency during this mid-childhood period. And actually, I suppose this is where touch might come in, because touch stays quite constant. The size of the body may change, but and how we weight vision and proprioception may change, but the simple feeling of a touch to the body is something that can stay constant across even that mid-childhood period. And perhaps, in fact, I'd like to propose that touch can really provide quite a key anchor across this mid-childhood period of sensory flux. So I just want to start off actually by going a little on to, actually this was the first sort of study I ran that really, I suppose, had anything to do with touch. I said I ran it, but this was run by JJ Begum Ali in Andy Bremner's lab, and I was involved in this project. And it was, I guess, my first introduction to touch, really. This is, again, a crossed hands task. And although Andy Bremner had found some evidence of a crossed hands deficit in infancy, this study is looking at a crossed hands paradigm in childhood. The reason for that is that Pagel, Heed and Brigitte Roeder had showed that there might not be a crossed hands deficit in childhood until mid-childhood. They'd shown that with a temporal order judgment task, which is rather tricky. And so we went back to a simpler task and looked at it. And in fact, what we found was that we placed the child's hands in a crossed or uncrossed posture here, and they received a buzz to one of their hands, and they had to say, did the buzz come from the penguin or the hedgehog? So it was a simpler task, and we found that indeed there was, by 4 years, a crossed hands deficit. So children found it harder to respond correctly if the hands were in the crossed posture. And what that indicates, again, is that the child was expecting a buzz to come from a certain location in visual space, that they had mapped those visual and tactile spaces on top of each other. So I do suggest from this study that, again, the basic sensory foundations for being able to use a touch to localize the hand in external space, but those are present certainly from 4 years of age, and indeed I'd argue younger. So I guess that was my first introduction to touch. But also I then conducted a series of studies on bodily illusions, and during those studies what I found really actually is that touch is a pretty consistent mediator of bodily awareness in children, and so I'll just sort of take you through that today. So I don't need to introduce this to most of you. This is the rubber hand illusion. And in this illusion, what we show is that synchronous stroking on a hidden real hand and a viewed fake hand leads to a drift of perceived hand position towards the fake hand, and also reports that the fake hand feels like part of one's own body. I'm just going to shut the window here, which is rattling. Give me 1 second. Can't concentrate with a rattling door. So what we find in this illusion is that there's visual over-reliance. So that is, children between 4 and 9 years of age tend to drift further towards the fake hand than adults do. And in fact, they drift about 3 times as far as adults do. So what that suggests is that just seeing a hand elicits some sense of ownership over that hand, or well, not ownership over that hand, but some sense that that hand location is your own hand location. And actually Maria Laura and Laura Cucinelli have actually showed that just seeing the hand can elicit drift towards that hand. So there's really sort of visual over-reliance, and again this shows just how much in flux the senses of vision and proprioception are at this age. However, there's also an independent and additional effect of visual-tactile synchrony. So when you view the strokes on the real hand and fake hand at the same time in the synchronous condition here in dark green, you have more drift towards the fake hand. And when they're asynchronous, sorry, PowerPoint seems to have given me 2 color codes here. These are the asynchronous bars. When they're asynchronous, so that vision and touch don't match, you don't get that same drift. So there is, from 4 to 5 years, an effect of visual-tactile synchrony that really grounds the sense of hand position. And the visual-tactile synchrony also feeds into a sense of ownership. So children feel the hand is more their own when the stroking is synchronous than when it's not. So visual-tactile synchrony, despite other changes in visual and proprioceptive weighting, visual-tactile synchrony is a pretty constant mediator of bodily awareness across this whole large range of ages that we tested. And that replicates as well. So we've done some more studies which really the main point of them was to look at other factors like how the posture of the hand is understood. But actually, for example, here in the posture study, again, we do find a pretty consistent effect of touch, so of visual-tactile synchrony. So here we had a hand in a congruent, slightly incongruent or very incongruent posture. But we found that there were effects of visual-tactile synchrony, again, on both drift towards the fake hand and ratings of ownership. I'll just show you the ratings here. And in fact, for the ratings, they weren't really, so how much do you feel like this hand is yours, or do you feel like the hand belongs to you? In this case, this is ratings for touch referral. So do you feel like you could feel the touch of the brush on the fake hand? And actually, for these kind of ratings, posture didn't really matter, even if the hand was like this. The thing that really mattered was touch. So you can see going from, in each of these posture conditions and ages, the really kind of crucial changes from the synchronous, from the synchronous to the asynchronous condition, where responses always reduce here. So our ratings go down as we break that visual-tactile synchrony. And so again, just to sort of pull out from this study, that visual-tactile synchrony and touch is a really key sort of anchor for bodily awareness, I think, and that comes out of this study. So also going through, again, what I've done in various studies and pulling out the effects of touch, we do find some limits and some caveats as well. So we've conducted a study of hand size, which we are really hoping to publish soon. This has been delayed by the effects of COVID on all the authors. But we basically looked at hand sizes so that we gave children a fake hand in the rubber hand illusion, which could be the same size as their own, but could also be smaller or larger. And again, we just induced the illusion and measured drift and ownership. And what we found was that there were clear effects of visual-tactile synchrony again. Now, there were effects on ownership ratings here, pretty clearly across all ages. So again, that suggests touch acting as an important mediator for bodily awareness. We actually here did not find effects of visuotactile synchrony on drift, so on the measure of hand location, perceived hand location. I'd suggest actually there's quite a good explanation for this, and that's that during this study, we delivered touch as dabs rather than strokes. So we dabbed the paintbrush on the real hand and the fake hand. The reason we did that was that we were worried if we delivered the touch as strokes that they would have been, the viewed and felt sensations would have been uneven. And I'll just show you what I mean here. So if I stroked for the same length, like 2 centimeters on the real hand, that would not have covered the same proportion of the fake hand. And we felt that was per control. So instead, we just dabbed on each hand. And so interestingly, I guess what that does is it reduces the amount of, just the sheer amount of touch information that children are getting during that paradigm. And we suggest that that reduced amount of information might actually have diminished the impact of touch a bit in this study, so that while it did influence ownership, it didn't quite influence perceived hand location as before. So there are limits, I think, to touch as an anchor. Again, I find limits in this paradigm. So in this paradigm, which we did with Jane Aspel a few years ago, you view a real body. Start again. You're standing here in your real body, and there's a camera behind you filming your back. And you receive a live feed of that camera going into your headset here, so that what you see in the headset is a virtual body. So it's your real body, but displaced to be standing in front of you. And we then take a stick and we brush on the back of the real body. And of course, you see synchronously touches on the back of the virtual body. So again, here we're using touch, or rather visuotactile synchrony, to elicit a bodily illusion here, a bodily illusion over a whole body, which is standing apart from you at a different perspective than you would normally have, a third-person perspective on your own body. Here, what we find actually is that there is an effect of visuotactile synchrony at the youngest age we tested, which here was 6 to 7 years. So you can see the gap between synchronous and asynchronous stroking. But we also did find that that gap significantly increased with age. So here's an 8 to 11, and here's adult. So the difference between synchronous and asynchronous stroking increased with age. And I think probably that while this shows that touch can really be enough to elicit a bodily illusion, even at the youngest age we tested, this is quite a it's a big ask, having an illusion of ownership over a body which is in a third-person perspective, because we know from the adult literature that perspective and having a first-person perspective is really important for understanding your own body. So I think touch is limited in the extent to which it can ground or drive or change bodily ownership when you pit it against other very powerful cues like perspective. It doesn't always quite win, but we can see here that it does actually have still quite a powerful and profound effect. So I want to tell you, just for the last part of my talk, a little bit about some recent work I've been doing on touch in virtual bodies. We've been using a moving hand illusion. I think the rubber hand illusion has told us a lot and is really important for some basic understanding. But, we do experience our body usually as a moving object and not a static one. I think it's really important to factor that into our understanding of body awareness and representation in childhood. And so we've been using a commercially available system where we track hand movements using a little controller here, more on that later. And so we put children in a virtual scene and we give them a virtual hand, and the virtual hand moves congruently with their own movements, or indeed we can make it move incongruently. So the cue here is visuomotor synchrony, visuomotor congruency, the primary cue. But we also were interested actually in touch, and so we also introduced a haptic sensation. I think it's good to call this a haptic sensation rather than a touch, because it's not quite a touch. What it was a 1 second buzz, and this is delivered through this controller that's sitting in your hand. And this buzz was either in synchrony with the, your target here was to touch the bubbles. So one of these 4 bubbles would light up blue, and you had to touch the blue bubble. And so in one condition, in the synchronous condition, as you touch that bubble, you receive the buzz in synchrony. In another condition, as you touch the bubble, and then 1 or 2 seconds afterwards, you receive a buzz. So it's a variable delay. And then in a third condition, you have no touch. So we were interested to see if that touch might facilitate feelings of ownership over the virtual hand. And actually, again, a lot of this study was designed to look at other factors. So we varied the form of the hand, whether it was a hand or a block, and we varied whether it was moving synchronously or asynchronously. And although we did find effects of visual-motor synchrony, and we found effects of form, so here a difference between a hand and a block, we actually didn't find any significant effects of touch here. We found that ownership, in this particular study, that ownership was quite high, even across the board, and that it wasn't really affected by touch. So that's a little bit surprising, because from our past work, of course, we might predict that touch actually is really important. So what was going on here? Well, I think actually it's probably back to the technology. So here, touch was delivered, as I've said, as a buzz through this Oculus Touch controller. So that buzz didn't really match the haptic sensation that you received. Just didn't really match what you would expect when you were grasping the blue light. You didn't feel a touch on the right part of your hand. You wouldn't feel a buzz when you were touching it. You would just feel a kind of light touch sensation. So the haptics here didn't really match what you would expect from what you saw. And I think, and also, of course, in the delay condition, most of what we've talked about is visual-tactile synchrony, but of course the synchrony didn't match in that condition. But even when the synchrony did match, the touch didn't really seem to boost your experience at all. So it actually is quite interesting to think about haptics within virtual environments and virtual embodiment. And this is something that I'm becoming interested in. I thought it might be interesting just to kind of tell you a little bit about it, because I've been learning about it recently. So newer models of virtual reality headset are trying to get away from clunky controllers a little. And so there are models that have finger tracking, where you can wave your hands around in space and in free movement, and a camera here fixed to the headset will pick up the positions of your fingers. Those, incidentally, used to not work with kids' hands at all, but they do now actually decently work. But then, while they let you have free movement, the problem with those is they don't produce any pressure sensations on the hand at all. They do let you, they do give viewed touch, so you can reach out the hand and quite freely grasp an object, but you don't get any pressure sensations to go with that. So this is a bit of an issue about how we really deliver touch in virtual embodied environments. So there's actually some sort of big money at the minute really working on this. This is the claw, which is being developed by IL-OFEC and others in Microsoft. And this is just one example of these kind of high-tech VR controllers that are now putting haptics at front and center of what they do. So you've put your hand into this controller, and it actually provides resistance, so that when you grasp a virtual object, you get resistance, and it feels therefore a bit more like you have a pressure sensation. They also let you, for example, feel different textures by providing appropriate vibrations to you, so that you feel textures, feel the rigidity of an object, feel its texture, feel pressure when you pick it up. So at least according to these guys, this really makes it possible to integrate touch into virtual experiences. And while that might seem like a bit of a sort of niche field, there is really an argument that virtual embodiment is something that we can really use within not only gaming, but also educational experiences for children. And we can also not only use those virtual experiences in useful ways for children, but we as experimenters can, of course, use them to pick apart some of the sensory and cognitive factors that influence and drive body representation. So in doing that, I think it is important to remember touch and perhaps try and integrate it better into these systems. Okay, so I'm going to end my essay there. As I say, I've just picked out what I've learned about touch and haven't told you everything I've learned about everything else. But I think I would say these are my conclusions, that touch is quite a constant anchor that allows a child to identify their own body despite the multisensory flux that they experience otherwise. But touch must be, to do this, touch must be delivered in volume. And it can't always override other key priors like perspective on the body. And I think we find that new technologies have to incorporate realistic touch sensations in order to enhance and scaffold our sense of virtual embodiment. So I'll finish there, but first of all, I just want to thank very much the people who've done this work. First of all, our funders at the ESRC, Andy Bremner, JJ and Tamar, who helped with some of the very early rubber hand work. Jane, who has been my full body illusion guru, Laura and Yana, who were involved in some of the later rubber hand studies, and then Marco and Harry, our computer science collaborators, who helped us develop some of these virtual environments, and Hayley, who has run those studies. So thanks to all those people who've done the hard work. Please feel free to follow me at these links, and thank you very much for listening.
So thank you so much, Dorothy. Very, very interesting talk. So thank you again. So now we have time for questions. I don't see any questions in the chat. So maybe I take the opportunity to ask you again about the critical periods. So you showed in your presentation that there is an effect of age in the experience of the rubber hand. So referring to what I asked before to Maria Laura, so we can talk about indeed some critical or sensitive periods. So do you agree?
Yeah, I would say that, well, I've mostly looked at childhood, and arguably if you look at the crossed hands stuff in infancy, there are seem to be some critical periods in infancy, perhaps up to 6 months, where you're remapping touch, and that's a specific thing, so mapping touch into external space. Then in terms of weighting sensory inputs for hand position, I would say that really it barely counts as a critical period, but up until maybe 9 or 10 years old, because there's a number of findings that go together. Like our rubber hand study shows that there's really a big change around 9 or 10 years. Some of the reaching studies show the same thing. Some of the pointing studies, where you're looking at integration of senses, also show the same thing. So up till about 9 to 10 years, I would say, which is a very, very long period. And that's why it's interesting still to look at childhood.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So I have another question. So we maybe we can think about, I don't know, traumatic experience or something like that. So in this way, an early traumatic experience that maybe can occur in few hours after birth or immediately postnatally. So maybe do you think that can alter this basic mechanism? So what do you think about it?
Yeah, so this is my favorite project, which was rudely interrupted by COVID. I have a project with Tamar Macon, who works on amputees and people with one hand, and we're actually studying how children with one hand understand their own bodies and actually how their brains reorganize to support that physical and motor difference. So I'm really interested to see at what age during childhood their brains are getting into a fixed state where they accept that they have one hand and becoming sort of wired for that. And that's some work actually being done now by Laura Bird, who helped on some of the rubber hand stuff. as part of her PhD. So I would love to tell you what we find another time. We're just about back to testing now.
Yes, thank you. So last questions. It's just a curiosity. So do you plan to do some maybe EEG experiment in children? So I am just thinking about yesterday from Alice Rossi Sebastiano's talk, brief talk. So they did an EEG experiment on the rubber hand illusion in healthy adults, so of course, but maybe do you plan to do some experiment like that, maybe to understand better the mechanism or the electrophysiological marker of the rubber hand illusion also in children?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting possibility, and I think it would be nice if there were a clear neural signature that we could get. Of course, one of the things about body representation is actually it's all over the brain. So, but I know there are some great papers on that already, and it is something I've thought about doing, but one that's on the very long possibilities list if I ever get there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So we have another question from Vittorio Gallese. So any evidence on twins since they experience touch in utero more than single fetuses?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and somebody should clearly do that experiment. Yes, we do have some twins with the one-handers. So we have some twins who one of them has a missing hand and one does not. And we're going to see how their brains differ, and we're quite excited to do that. But yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Dorothy. It was very amazing. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
So thank you.